Okay, good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kemnele Kelechi. Okay, great. I think it's working now. My name is Kemnele Kelechi, and on behalf of my colleagues, I'm here to do a presentation on a paper titled Sexual Orientation of Students in a Nigerian University and Their Knowledge of Lesbians, Gays, Bisexuals, and Transgenders. So going straight to it, lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders, they represent a distinct group within the gay culture and popularly known as LGBT under the LGBT umbrella. To describe them, you would describe them as individuals who are attracted to people of the same sex or people attracted to members of the same sex and opposite sex at the same time, or it could also be described as persons who are experiencing a mismatch between their gender and their sex. That would be referring specifically to transgenders. Now, we all know that we live in a global village because of internet and connectivity. And because of that, we experience a continuous infusion of beliefs and ideas from developed worlds to developing or underdeveloped worlds. Now, one of such ideas or beliefs that are being infused continuously into this world, such as Africa, Nigeria, for instance, is the idea of sexuality and also the LGBT. Now, this for our research, we come to understand that there's a general dearth of information about sexuality among students in Nigeria. Also, there's also low knowledge about LGBT in Nigeria and Africa generally. Well, apart from a few researches that were carried out in South Africa about LGBT persons. We also understood that UNAIDS talked about 70% of homosexual men who are infected with HIV/AIDS in Nigeria, and this population of men that are infected with HIV/AIDS actually represent 10% of new HIV/AIDS infections in Nigeria. So we get to see that there's basically a low representation of LGBT people in epidemiological data. This made it imperative for us to carry out this research because we wanted to determine the sort of sexual orientation that exists among university students while trying to assess their knowledge and about LGBTs. But we also asked ourselves, why university students? Why not some other population? We were specific about university students because we believe that the population of educated youths who are generally open to new ideas, and they also adopt ideas with relative more ease, and they would basically determine the percentages of existing sexual orientations. We also understand that the LGBT persons are also known to be as an at-risk population, a hidden population, especially in the scourge of HIV. So this research would most likely try to determine ways of creating specific intervention and services for this at-risk population. Also try to show the way services might give us an understanding of how services could be provided within the ambits of the law, and also basically try to explain the sexual patterns and behaviors among students in an academic institution. For this research, our objectives were to determine the sexual orientation of students in the University of Ibadan, and then to determine their level of knowledge about LGBT. The study was a descriptive cross-sectional study, and our study population were students of the University of Ibadan, English, and both undergraduate and postgraduate students. We had a sample size of 422, and our tool was semi-structured, and we also had a qualitative aspect of our research because it was also some sort of exploratory research, given that it wasn't something that had been looked into extensively. But because of the duration I'll have to present this work, we'll basically concentrate on the quantitative aspect of the research. We also had ethical approval from the University of Ibadan, University College Hospital Ethical Review Committee, and because of how sensitive the research was, we made sure we got consent from all students that we are recruited into the study. Now, going to the results. The result itself is would be broken into two: the sexual orientation part and the knowledge of LGBT. Now, looking at the sexual orientation, we discovered that 23% of our students knew someone who was an LGBT person, and 51% of them claimed to have had sexual intercourse Now, of the population who had had sexual intercourse at the time of this study, we found out that 0.9% of them had had sexual intercourse with both males and females. Looking at their sexual attraction, we found out that 90% of the students claim to be sexually attracted to people of the opposite sex. And then the way we arrange our questions, we try to decipher their sexual behavior, their sexual attraction, and their sexual identification. We found that regarding their sexual attraction also, 69% of them, when asked a question about who they dreamed about or who they thought about when they were thinking about sex or daydreaming about sex, 69% of them said that they dreamed about people of the opposite sex. 0.7% talked about being attracted to members of the same sex as them. But another 0.7% were attracted to members of the opposite sex and same sex, and same percentage said they dreamed about people of the opposite sex and same sex when asked that question. We also found out that, however, there was a group, 57% of them, 5.7% rather, who had no sexual attraction whatsoever, and 1.2 who are uncertain about who they were sexually attracted to. They're trying to understand which sort of sexual relationship appealed to them. 95% of them stated that heterosexual relationships appealed to them the most. 0.7 stated that bisexual relationships appealed to them the most. And we have 1.9 and 2.4% who said that they had no appeal for any form of sexual relationship or they were uncertain. So we were able to, from the questions we had, we were able to categorize the students into different sexual orientations. And what we came up with was that 95% of the students, 95.7% of the students were heterosexuals, 0.9% of them were bisexuals. We didn't have anyone that could fully categorize as homosexual, and would explain that later. And we had 1.2% who said they had no sexual attraction whatsoever for any of the genders, and 2.1% who were uncertain about their sexual orientation. So doing a chi-square analysis, we found that there was a significant association between the sexual orientation of students and the experience of sexual intercourse. However, there are 3.3% of the students who had not had sexual intercourse ever in their life who claim to be non-heterosexuals. So we want to believe that this would be as a result of their sexual identification and their sexual attraction, and not their sexual behavior. However, there were also noted that there were more non-heterosexual females than males, and that all married students reported to be heterosexuals. They're looking at religion. Among the persons who fitted into the non-heterosexual category, 16% of them are Christians and 0.5% of them were Muslims. Now, moving to the knowledge about LGBTs, from the tool we used, which was a 14-item tool, we noticed that 69% of the students had moderate level of knowledge about LGBT. Only 8.5% of them had good knowledge about LGBTs. And going further, 20% of the students who had poor knowledge reported that they did not know an LGBT person. Nonetheless, we've also noted that there was a statistical significant association between their knowledge of LGBT and knowing someone who was an LGBT person. There was, however, no association between the person's sexual orientation and the person's knowledge about LGBTs. To our discussion, we've come to generally understand that there are disparities in determining the person's sexual orientation. These disparities were also recorded in a research that was carried out in the Williams Institute. And we know that these disparities is basically because it's somewhat difficult to assign a person to a particular sexuality based on the person's sexual attraction. It's basically it's easier to do that based on the person's sexual behavior, and not even as easy with using the person's sexual self-identification. We also come to understand that domains to identify the person's sexuality bordered on the person's sexual attraction, his behavior, and his identification, as we had said earlier. But using these domains, it's still difficult to sort of assess a person's sexual orientation, especially in Nigeria, because of how sensitive the nature of sexuality is, the concept of sexuality itself, and because of the criminalization of non-heterosexual acts in Nigeria, And because of the general negative cultural religious beliefs regarded about non-heterosexuality in Nigeria. Nonetheless, Nonetheless, we noticed that there was a low percentage of persons who reported to be non-heterosexual, less than 1.1%. We had 0.9%, and they all identified as bisexuals. But we also found that it was similar in two other studies where we had 2.6% of students identify as non-heterosexuals, and 2.5% of adolescents in a different study identify as non-heterosexuals. We still want to believe that it's because of the same disparities that I had mentioned earlier, why you have less people identifying to be these non-heterosexuals. That's what we may believe. But we noticed that all students that claim to be bisexuals, which was the only form of non-heterosexuality we identified, were females. This was also reported in a study that was carried out in Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife in Nigeria. And we want to believe that why it's only bisexuality and no form of homosexuality is because from our qualitative aspect of the research, we noticed that homosexuality among females wasn't strongly frowned at as compared to homosexuality among males, and that somehow homosexuality among males was seen as a form of emasculation. And also females who tended to be homosexual also wanted to show a notch of being bisexual so they would not be really judged. That was what we were able to garner from our qualitative aspect of our research. However, we also noticed that there were more undergraduate students who subscribed to other sexual orientations, non-heterosexual orientations than postgraduate students. And we want to believe that it's because of the age difference, as we also came to see that most undergraduates were definitely younger than postgraduate students, and these undergraduates they tend to be more exposed or more willing to want to experiment with different forms of sexuality. Regarding knowledge on LGBT, we know that there are gaps in the knowledge level, and these gaps were also reported in a research among Swedish medical nursing students, but found out that there were higher knowledge scores in a research that was basically focused on medical students. We generally noticed that the gaps we are found regarding the discrepancies in trying to determine the point of inception of LGBT by an individual. At one point, a person could be tagged to be an LGBT person. But nonetheless, we also still found out that there are more undergraduates who had more knowledge about LGBT than postgraduates. The marginal difference was just 2%, might not be considered fully significant, but it still might play an important role to understand that age might be a factor in determining people's level of knowledge about LGBT persons. We also noticed that there was no significant association between the socio-demographic characteristics of students and their knowledge. This was also reported in a different study. To conclude, we can categorically say that other sexual orientations exist in Nigeria apart from heterosexuality, and we also understand that there's a moderate increase in knowledge of LGBT, especially among young persons as they are becoming more knowledgeable and exposed to such things. Because of this study reveals that the more knowledgeable people are, the more they are likely to be more accepting of LGBT persons. So there's a need to explore the mitigation of diseases among this at-risk group of persons that I'm talking about, the LGBT persons, and there's a need to decipher more astute methods to carry out evidence-driven researches regarding the plight of LGBT persons and regarding their health status, because LGBT persons are not fully recognized in most epidemiological data, and given the scourge of HIV/AIDS and the battle we are putting in place to try to win the battle against HIV/AIDS, we notice that when you look at persons who have higher chances of being infected, persons that fall under the LGBT umbrella might not be fully taken into consideration. And that is, so there's a need to carry out more researches to look at those LGBT persons and look for ways to try to help them within the ambits of the law. Thank you very much. So these are my references, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kelechi. That was a wonderful presentation. And now we are turning into Q&A section. So, dear participants, please raise questions in the chat box so that Mr. Kelechi will answer.
Okay, I can see a question from TG's Tedia Mulugeta. He asks if participants were willing. Yes, for we had 422 participants, and for each of them, we had to first of all explain our research before we even gave them questionnaires, and they were willing and they consented, and we had complete responses for all 422 respondents that partook in the study. Yes, Mbagwana said, during my research, did I take into consideration that some of these people would hide their real sexual orientation? Of course, of course. Because of the disparities I mentioned, we knew that most persons would definitely want to hide their sexual orientation. So to do that, given what we did was we understood that to determine the person's sexual orientation, there are three three variables that would come into play: the person's sexual behavior, the person's sexual attraction, and the person's self-identification as of his own or her own sexual orientation. So what we did was within the questionnaire, our questionnaire was our research. We made them understand that we're trying to decipher their sexuality and then their knowledge, but we scattered our questions on sexuality. We didn't just have a straight in our questionnaire. We didn't have a dedicated section that was trying to decipher questions on their sexuality. So, for instance, we could ask a couple of questions about their knowledge, and then we'll ask a question about what they think about this sexuality, about that sexuality, and so that way we now notice that if we spread the questions within our tool, and there was no way a person who had reported yes to being sexually attracted to someone of the same sex, and after saying yes like 3 or 4 times, and then he comes out later maybe on the sixth question, which was scattered randomly, to now say no, he's not sexually attracted. We understand that there was some sort of disparity there. So we had a score with which we used to know that at least out of our 6 questions we used to try to determine the person's orientation, if the person could at least pick out 4 of those questions, we believe that those 4 questions could confidently point us to a person's sexual orientation. Williams Ege says, could the laws in Nigeria contribute to the knowledge? The laws in Nigeria would contribute, but we wouldn't say they would really contribute to the level of knowledge. All the laws in Nigeria would do would be to let people know that if you are caught practicing non-heterosexual acts, you'll be criminalized. So that is basically all that the law would do. So the law would only it would only inform them about the criminalization of being involved in non-heterosexual acts, and that's basically all that the law would do. We have Obed saying, how would you generalize your findings to other higher learning institutions based on your sample size? Okay, now based on sample size, basically, first of all, I'd like to say that the University of Ibadan, which we used as our study site, had close to 6,000 thereabout students, undergraduate and postgraduates, and that is basically you find that population among most federal universities in Nigeria. So we took our time to use the population at number of students at that given time when the study was carried out to create a sample size. So we want to believe that doing that and following the right sampling methods, that we should be able to generalize our findings to other universities in Nigeria.
Dear participants, one more minute for closing the polling session. Please vote for Mr. Kelechi. The polling session is ended here.